I had lived in Villisca, Iowa, for most of my life, and the night of June 9, 1912, was like any other. The small town, home to just over 2,000 people, was a close-knit community where neighbors looked out for each other. That's what we did back then. But what happened that night would forever change our town and leave scars that would never fully heal. My name is Mary Peckham, and that morning, I made a discovery that still haunts me. It was early, just after dawn, on the morning of June 10, 1912. I remember standing on my front porch, looking across the yard at the Moore household. Josiah Moore was my neighbor. He lived there with his wife, Sarah, and their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul. It was unusual not to see any signs of life from their house. They were a hard-working family, and Josiah was always up and about by this time, tending to his chores. I called out across the lawn, but there was no answer. The silence around their home was unsettling, and my stomach was knotted with a creeping sense of dread. The house seemed to have an unnatural stillness, almost as if it were holding its breath. I walked over to their yard and knocked on the door. Nothing. No movement. I tried the door again. A quiet panic rose in me as I realized something was wrong. I hurried back to my house, my heart racing, and called for help. One of the neighbors, Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived shortly after. Together, we tried the door again, but this time Ross went in. I remember standing on the porch, nervously waiting, praying that everything was fine. But the look on Ross's face when he came out will stay with me forever. "Mary, you should call the marshal." His voice trembled, and I could see the horror in his eyes. I didn't need to ask what he'd seen. I knew. When Marshal Hank Horton arrived, he quickly took charge, entering the house to investigate. The rest of us stood outside, pacing, not knowing what to expect. But no one could have predicted what they would find inside that house. Inside the Moore house, it was as if time had stopped. The entire family, Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, had been brutally murdered in their beds. The 2 Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina, who had been staying the night as guests, had also been slaughtered. They were just children, only visiting because they wanted to spend the night with their friend Catherine. Marshal Horton said that all of them had been struck with an axe, repeatedly, while they slept. The details were grotesque. Josiah had been hit so many times that the axe had left deep gouges in the ceiling above the bed. Whoever had done this had covered the faces of the victims with clothes after the murders, almost as if they couldn't bear to look at what they had done. The axe, the very tool used to take their lives, was found abandoned in the house. It was Josiah's axe. The news spread through Villisca like wildfire. The quiet streets of our town were soon filled with people, men, women, and children, gathering in disbelief. How could something so horrifying happen in our peaceful little town? Who could do such a thing? Rumors started swirling immediately. Some said it must have been a stranger passing through town, someone who didn't belong there. Others whispered about old grudges, suggesting that someone in town might have had it out for Josiah. But as the day dragged on, it became clear that we had no answers. The Moore family had no known enemies. Josiah was a respected businessman, and Sarah was active in the church. Their children were well-liked and bright. The Stillinger girls, who had been spending the night, came from a good family too. There was no reason for anyone to hurt them. Over the weeks that followed, investigators came to Villisca, combing through every detail, interviewing everyone they could. The first name that came up was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in town the night of the murders. He was an odd man, strange, even, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold him. He confessed once but then recanted, and his trial ended in an acquittal. Another name that surfaced was Frank F. Jones, a prominent local businessman who had once worked with Josiah Moore. Some believed there was bad blood between them, but the theory that he had orchestrated the murders was never proven. There were others too, drifters and strangers who had passed through town, but every lead went cold. The town was left in limbo, trapped in the horror of that night, with no justice for the victims. As the weeks turned into months, and months into years, the murders of the Moore family, and the Stillinger girls became an open wound that Villisca could never quite heal. The Moore house, once full of life and love, stood empty, a ghostly reminder of the darkness that had swept through our town. And the house, it was never the same. Some say the spirits of Josiah, Sarah, their children, and the Stillinger girls never left. People reported strange occurrences. Lights flickering in the windows when no one was inside, doors creaking open in the dead of night, and cold spots that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. A few brave souls claimed they'd seen shadowy figures moving through the house after dark. I can't say for sure what they saw, but I know that I've felt it too, the weight of something left unresolved, something that lingers, refusing to move on. I tried to avoid the house as much as I could after that, but sometimes, I'd find myself standing in front of it, staring at the windows where I used to see the children playing. It felt wrong that something so evil could happen in a place that once held so much joy. Some nights, when the wind blew just right, I could swear I heard whispers, soft, distant, like children calling out, asking for help. They say that the house is still haunted by the souls of the Moore family, trapped in the place where their lives were stolen. Paranormal investigators from across the country come to Villisca now, looking for evidence of the spirits that linger there. Some say they've seen them, the shadows of little Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, moving through the hallways, searching for peace that never comes. But for me, the worst part isn't the idea that the house is haunted. The worst part is knowing that whoever did this, whoever brought this horror to our town, got away with it. They walked away from that house, leaving nothing but death behind, and they were never brought to justice. And so, the Moore family, the Stillinger girls, and the rest of us who lived through that terrible time, remain haunted by the horror of what happened that night, and by the fact that we may never know why. It's been years now, and Villisca has moved on, but the memory of that night still lingers. People come from all over to see the house, to feel the chill that hangs in the air. But for those of us who were here when it happened, it's not just a ghost story. It's a part of our past, a wound that never fully heals. The Villisca axe murders left a mark on this town, and on all of us who were there that day, a mark that time cannot erase.